Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, a warm welcome to this second session of Winter Tales. It is a great honour and a pleasure to introduce the Very Reverend Professor Ian Bradley, Emeritus Professor of Cultural and Spiritual History at the University of St Andrews, where he was Principal of St Mary's College. Ian is the author of over 30 books on cultural and spiritual matters, ranging from Gilbert and Sullivan to the message of the musicals, to the spiritual identity of Britishness, Celtic spirituality, and pilgrimage. He is an expert on carols, having published the Penguin Book of Carols and the Daily Telegraph Book of Carols. And his title today is typically provocative and intriguing. O come, all ye Jacobites, the hidden history of carols. Ian.
Thank you very much indeed, Principal. Great honour to be introduced by the Principal of New College. I may say I'm no longer very reverend, even, I don't think I ever was, but that went, sadly, when I ceased to be Principal, so I'm back to my usual status. It's wonderful to be here and marvellous to be part of this winter festival. Many congratulations to Alison, Jack and Jolyon Mitchell for putting it on. I think it's a fantastic programme. I never thought I would see a twinkling Christmas tree in the Church of Scotland's Assembly Hall. It's very appropriate, actually, because I'm going to be lowering the tone quite a lot this afternoon compared with that rather elevating first hour that we had. I should begin with a confession, not quite of mortal sin, but of abject failure, because I have been unable to find a carol, at least a well-known carol or a carol in the books written by an alumnus or alumna of New College. I have to say there's a bit of a shortage of Edinburgh-sourced carols generally, so get writing. Nor have I been able to find a carol written for or during a pandemic. There are, of course, plenty of hymns for pandemics. Probably many of you know that Nun dankert alle Gott, now thank we all our God, was written by Martin Rinkart in the Saxon town of Eilenberg, either during or after a terrible plague which ravaged the town in 1637, and in which more than 8,000 inhabitants died. And Rinkart himself, almost unbelievably, buried 4,000 of his own parishioners, some days conducting mass funerals of 50 or more at a time. And he wrote Nun dankert alle Gott at the end of the pandemic. A bit nearer to home, the great John Mason Neale, the man responsible for Good King Wenceslas, in 1866 wrote a 10-verse hymn for use at the time of a cattle plague, all creation groans and travails, appropriate verses, including this one, cast thine eye of love and mercy on the misery of the land, say to the destroying angel, 'tis enough, stay now thine hand. And he goes on, that our oxen strong to labour may not know nor fear decay, that there be no more complaining, and the plague have passed away. So we could almost sing that in this time of pandemic. There's a whole thesis done by a PhD student at the University of York some time ago about the use of music in response to plagues between 1350 and 1600. And this thesis does point to the importance of the Laude, the Lauda or Lauda was a kind of Italian song sung particularly by Franciscan friars and penitential, often in a penitential context in the 13th and 14th century Italy. And this thesis does suggest that they are actually quite often sung in the context of plagues and pestilences. And we're going to come back to the significance of the Laudae later, so maybe that does give us a kind of connection between carols and pandemics. In their origins, and for most of their existence, carols have been wonderfully anarchic and anti-establishment, popular and vulgar in the best sense of the word, viewed with intense suspicion by the ecclesiastical establishment. Indeed, for much of the Middle Ages, prescribed, very distinctly prescribed by church councils, largely banned from use in worship in both the Church of Scotland and the Church of England for several hundred years. Eric Routley, the great 20th century Reformed theologian and hymnologist, defined carols as songs with a religious impulse that are simple, hilarious, popular, and modern. And many, as I'll be seeking to persuade you tonight, have a rather racy backstory suggesting a much more earthy and boozy genesis than might be suggested by images of robed choir boys singing ethereal descants about angels. I rather like, for example, the fact that one of the most ethereal of our carols, particularly popular by purists, particularly by musical purists, and often known by its tune, Bethlehem Down, the words begin, "When he is king, we will give him the king's gift," was actually written on a pub crawl through Hampshire. The author, Bruce Blunt, an amateur poet, was desperately hard up and decided that writing a carol for publication might help him to get suitably drunk for Christmas. And the words of this carol, which some of you probably know, came to him one moonlit night as he was wending his way between the plough at Bishop Sutton and the anchor at Ropley. And slightly similar is a story that I got from Richard Harris, the former Bishop of Oxford, that T.S. Eliot wrote The Journey of the Magi, a cold coming we have of it that so many of us use in services leading up to Christmas. Eliot actually wrote that poem rather quickly one Sunday morning between church service and lunch with the aid of half a bottle of gin. So it's good to know that a lot of carols have very boozy origins. It now seems unthinkable to celebrate or survive the festive season without them, but carols originally had nothing at all to do with Christmas, nor even Christianity. They go back through the old French word carole, just our word with an E at the end of it, and the Latin corolla, to the Greek choros, a circling dance which was often, but not always, accompanied by singing, and was particularly associated with celebration of fertility rites, which is largely why the early church was so iffy about them. They were deeply suspect in the eyes of the early church. As I say, their performance was banned by successive church councils well into the Middle Ages. And the earliest reference that I've found to the word carol in English literature, which dates from around 1300, has absolutely no religious connotations at all and simply seems to connote a round dance. Incidentally, it's quite chilly in here, and if any of you feel the urge to dance, please do so. I won't be at all offended if anyone does a little carol or chorus or round dance at any point. Carols were Christianized by the new humanism which spread across Europe in the 14th century. As I'm sure you know, there was a marked change of emphasis from the death of Jesus to the birth of Jesus, the incarnation. And of course, we associate it with the crib, the coming of the crib, as a very significant image in Christianity, often associated with St. Francis of Assisi, possibly rightly, possibly not, but we often think of the first crib as being in Greccio in Italy and associated with Francis. But it is certainly among Franciscan friars, and here we come back to the Laude I mentioned earlier, Franciscan friars who seem to bring songs about Jesus with popular tunes into popular currency, with a folk idiom and a dance rhythm. And certainly the earliest known English Christmas carol, A Child is Born Among Men, is in a set of sermon notes written by a Franciscan friar around 1350, and the earliest Scottish carol that I've been able to come across was written by a Scottish Franciscan friar in 1372. It's among a collection of lullabies to the infant Jesus. So it's really in the latter part of the 14th century, through Franciscan friars, that we start getting what we would recognize as carols, songs specifically about the birth of Jesus, again, set to sort of popular dancing tunes. The period from 1400 to 1500 was the heyday of the English carol. Among those written then which are still sung today are Adam lay abounden, Lully Lola, My Little Tiny Child, the Coventry Carol, which of course came from an outdoor mystery play performed in the streets, and as you'll see, this is going to be typical of a lot of carols. Their distinguishing feature of these early carols is the burden or the refrain, usually a couplet repeated after every stanza. And for the purists, a carol is really only a carol if it has that burden or refrain, two-verse refrain after every verse. And it's an indication of the carol's origins in folk song and dance, and its greater suitability for exuberant performance in the home or the street, rather than solemn chanting in a church, which really wasn't happening at all, that they have this sort of dance rhythm and this short, simple refrain. Essentially, singing carols was really, until very recently, an extra ecclesiastical activity carried out in the streets, in the pubs, and in homes, but emphatically not in church. It was only in the mid-19th century in England, particularly in the Church of England, and rather later in the 19th century here in Scotland and in the Church of Scotland, that carols almost literally came in from the cold, no longer the sole preserve of wassailers in the streets and mummers and people singing in their homes and houses, but incorporated into Advent and Christmas services, along, of course, with cribs and Christmas trees. The Victorian reinvention of Christmas as a festival full of sentimentality and good cheer, and really brought in a lot of the carols that we now sing. The vast majority of our most popular carols are Victorian creations. And it was, of course, the Victorians, rather than Bing Crosby, who invented the whole concept of the White Christmas, bringing snow into the nativity story very incongruously, because all the evidence would suggest that Jesus was probably born in the middle of the summer, with Christina Rossetti's In the Bleak Midwinter, which is still one of the most popular carols, Edward Caswell's See Amid the Winter Snow, and of course Neil's Good King Wenceslas that I've often mentioned. The Victorian carols often very strong on moralizing, as we'll see and we'll come to a little later. American writers were 19th century American writers were particularly infused with the sentimental spirit of the Victorian Christmas, and equally happy to ditch biblical accuracy for the sake of enhancing the wintry atmosphere and the kind of cozy glow and pointing a moral. I found it quite a shock when I was doing my Penguin Book of Carols to find out just how many of our best-loved carols, which I think I'd rather assumed were traditionally British, all have an American origin, North American origin. They include the ghastly Away in a Manger, with its assertion, which Sally Foster Fulton has already mentioned earlier this afternoon, that totally unbiblical line, the little Lord Jesus no crying he makes, which 51% of British clergy think is the most heretical line in any hymn or carol, and I rather agree with them. Docetism at its worst, that is American. We Three Things of Orient Are, O Little Town of Bethlehem, and a carol which I'll be coming back to, It Came Upon the Midnight Clear. So there's 4 of our most popular carols in this country, all coming from North American writers. Many of you will know Thomas Hardy's wonderful novels, and particularly Under the Greenwood Tree, published in 1872, which laments the passing of the centuries-old tradition of waits and wassailers going through towns and villages at Christmas, accompanied by the local church gallery bands, those wonderful bands, mostly of stringed and wind instruments that used to play in the West Gallery of many English parish churches. And ironically, or perhaps not ironically, it was the very forces which Hardy blamed for killing off those popular expressions of folk religion, namely high church clergy with their robed choirs and organs, which brought carols back into the church in a conscious revival, as they saw it, of medieval practice. It was principally high church Anglicans who brought carols into the Church of England in the mid-19th century, and to some extent Scoto-Catholics in the Church of Scotland who then followed them. A key moment or key year was 1878, Christmas Eve 1878, when the choir of the relatively new cathedral at Truro, the new diocese of Truro, the choir switched from their usual practice, which would have been typical of most church and cathedral choirs at that time, of going round the city on Christmas Eve singing carols. They switched to a late night service on Christmas Eve, at which the story of the Nativity was told through lessons interspersed with carols. And this, of course, this crucial move became the prototype for the service of 9 lessons and carols, taken up perhaps most famously by King's College, Cambridge, just at the end of the First World War in 1918, and subsequently by churches and cathedrals up and down the country, and of course including around that time in Scotland. So that's a sort of brief history of the carol. It doesn't come into churches really until well on in the 19th century, and for most of its existence, the carol has been a kind of extra-ecclesial, rather anarchic, popular affair. When the church took them over and sanitized them, carols lost something of their anarchic, populist, anti-establishment, rather subversive character. And what I want to go on to now is to talk about this hidden history and the fact that several of our best-known carols may actually have very subversive, hidden political messages. Let's take O Come All Ye Faithful, which you're beginning, I think, your carol service with tonight, which on the face of it seems a straightforward hymn of adoration to the newborn Christ. But in fact, many of us who've worked on it think may actually, in its original Latin form, and of course it started, as you know, as a Adeste Fideles, have been a coded message to rally Jacobites to the cause of Bonnie Prince Charlie on the eve of his rebellion against the British Crown in 1745. We are pretty certain that the author of Adeste Fideles was a man called John Wade, who was a fervent Jacobite, a very strong Roman Catholic. He was the plain chant scribe at the English College at Douai in France, which was something of a hotbed of Jacobitism. They had a weekly mass praying for the return of the Stuarts to the British throne. And the very earliest manuscript we can find of Adeste Fidelis, which we can date pretty well to 1744-45, is covered with Stuart ciphers, with Scotch thistles, with references to Regum Nostrum Jacobum, our true King James. James, of course, the old pretender, the son of James VII. And it's called to the faithful, many historians now think, may actually have a double meaning and been intended to alert supporters of the king over the water to Charles James Stuart's imminent arrival in Britain. And that very interesting reference in the Latin to Rex Angelorum, which of course we translate as King of the Angels, may possibly have meant King of the English, the true King of the English, Rex Angelorum, in contrast to the Hanoverian incumbent George II. In its original Latin form, and of course for a long time it was just sung in Latin, it was only sung in Roman Catholic churches in Britain. There's no evidence I can find, or anyone else who's looked at it, that it was sung in Protestant churches. It was sung particularly in the embassy chapels of Catholic countries in London. Some of you may know the tune is often called the Portuguese hymn, and it was particularly sung in the Portuguese embassy chapel in London. So there's a lot of evidence, circumstantial evidence, suggesting that O Come All Ye Faithful in its original Latin incarnation could have actually been, as I say, a kind of Jacobite rallying cry. There's another, I suppose we'd call it carol, kind of Christmas song, which may well also have been a kind of coded message, again, to Catholics, and that is the 12 days of Christmas. On the first day of Christmas, my true love sent to me. Now, there's all sorts of theories about the origins of this carol. It first appears in 1780, or at least the first printed version of it appears in 1780. It possibly came from France. I'm actually doing quite a lot of research on it at the moment and writing an article about it, so it's very much in my mind. But there is a strong suggestion, as some of you may know, that actually it was written to teach the elements of the Roman Catholic faith, particularly to children, at a time when Catholicism was proscribed and suppressed in the United Kingdom. And in this reading, 5 gold rings, for example, either represent the 5 wounds of the crucified Christ or the 5 obligatory Roman Catholic sacraments. Now, there are other theories that it wasn't specifically Catholic, but it was actually a way of teaching the basics of the Christian faith to children, and 5 gold rings is probably the sacraments, but 4 calling birds would be the 4 evangelists or the 4 gospels, and so on. I think it's difficult to know. As I say, I'm still working on this, and it's quite hard to know. There's some suggestion that the theory about it being coded Catholic doctrine was relatively recently propounded, and there isn't very strong grounds for it, but there's certainly a lot of work to be done on it, and I'm having great fun. There are other scholars who suggest it's got nothing whatsoever to do with the Christian faith, and it's actually a list of the essential accoutrements of a country estate in terms of the domestic animals and the wildfowl and the staff, the 9 maids are milking, and even suggestions that the lords are leaping are the footmen. And there's quite a strong body of opinion which actually would claim this was written as a sort of indication of a country estate. In more recent times, it's lent itself to much adaptation, notably a rather splendid alcoholic version, which I'm really going to desecrate the hallowed hall where I've sat through many rather tedious debates with. So let me just give you a little burst of this. 12 tequila slammers, 100 pipers, 10 shots of absinthe, 9 Remy Martins, 8 vodka tonics, 7 cheap dry sherries, 6 Bacardi breezers, 5 double gins, 4 Smirnoff Ice, 3 real A's, 2 rum and coke, and a lager for 99p. There's also a wonderfully sort of politically correct version. Some of you may have come across this, an environmentally friendly version, which begins 12 males reclaiming their inner warrior through ritual drumming, 11 pipers piping, plus the 18-member pit orchestra made up of members of the Musicians' Union, as called for in their contract, even though they'll not be asked to play a note. 10 melanin-deprived, testosterone-poisoned scions of the patriarchal ruling class system leaping, 9 persons engaged in rhythmic self-expression, 8 economically disadvantaged female persons stealing milk products from enslaved bovines, 7 endangered swans swimming on protected wetlands, 6 enslaved fowl producing stolen non-human animal products, 5 golden symbols of culturally sanctioned enforced domestic incarceration, 4 hours of recorded whale songs, 3 deconstructionist poets, 2 World Wildlife Charity calendars printed on recycled processed tree carcasses, and an environmental activist chained to an old-growth pear tree. Parodies of carols, of course, are absolutely wonderful. I'm going to give you a few more later, but they show, I think, just how deeply carols have penetrated into our collective psyche. Like hymns, often, sometimes the parodies are rather better than the originals, but in this case, it's a fascinating carol, which, as I say, I think more work needs to be done on. Just going back to subversive messages in carols, there may be messages of a slightly different kind lurking in another familiar carol, Angels from the Realms of Glory, which first appeared in a radical Sheffield newspaper entitled The Iris on Christmas Eve 1816. Its author, James Montgomery, born in Irvine, who was the editor of the paper, twice imprisoned for his radical views for supporting the French Revolution and reform riots in Britain. And if you look at the original last verse of that hymn, it contains references to justice repealing the sentences and mercy breaking the chains of those doomed to punishment and imprisonment. You won't find it in a single hymn book. It was cut out by the editors who remove it, probably because they felt it was too political and subversive. A carol with a more overtly political message, which I've already mentioned, one of the 19th century American carols, which is still very popular. It came upon the midnight clear with the wonderful tune, of course, by the blessed Arthur Sullivan, whose my biography of whom I'm seeking to flog to you outside. He will get one more mention today. The author of It Came Upon the Midnight Clear, Edmund Sears, who claimed descent from one of the original Pilgrim Fathers, was a Unitarian minister in Massachusetts. A lot of the American carols, interestingly, written by Unitarians. He had extremely liberal political views, a deep commitment to social reform and the promotion of peace. And he wrote It Came Upon the Midnight Clear in 1849, the year after all the great revolutions in Europe and the year after the particularly bloody war between the United States and Mexico. And I think they were very much in his mind when he wrote the line, "Oh, hush, the noise, ye men of strife, and hear the angels sing." And his hymn, of course, which, as you'd expect from a Unitarian, has very little direct reference to Jesus, expresses a heartfelt longing for a future age of gold when peace shall over all the earth its ancient splendors fling. So almost certainly a kind of political message there by the ultra-liberal Edmund Sears, looking forward to an age of peace. It's a sign, as I say, of the hold that carols have on our psyche, that they have so often been parodied and adapted to suit particular moods and circumstances. The hugely popular German carol, or Austrian really, if we give it its proper origin, Stille Nacht. I'm sure you all know the circumstances of its composition in the Tyrolean village of Obendorf, when, according to one story, a mouse had eaten through the organ wires, and so the organist Franz Gruber played it on the guitar, and the priest had written it. But Stille Nacht, which is still high up in the British top 10, not number one. We're going to be singing, or we aren't going to be singing number one tonight, but we're going to be listening to it, as I'll say in a moment. But Stille Nacht underwent several fascinating adaptations through 20th century Germany, expressing the changing political mood. There was a socialist version entitled The Workers' Silent Night, which circulated widely around 1900, highlighting the prevailing poverty and misery and distress, and ending with an appeal to wake up to social action rather than sleep in heavenly peace. That was considered rather subversive and banned by the German government before the First World War. During the First World War, of course, famously, the German soldiers and the British Tommies crossed the line on that first Christmas Eve and supposedly sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night, together. But also during the First World War, German soldiers adapted Stille Nacht to express a sense of homesickness. In the period of rampant inflation that followed in the 1920s in the Weimar Republic, a social democratic version of Stille Nacht asked plaintively, "In poverty, one starves silently. When does the Saviour come?" And then in 1940, a Nazi adaptation turned the song into a celebration of motherhood and traditional German family values, and pointed out that while all around were asleep, only the Chancellor, faithfully alert, keeps watch on Germany's prosperity. So you've got a wonderful sense there, I think, of how a very popular carol is adopted and adapted for political purposes. More recent parodies in English have tended to focus on the commercial aspects of the festive season, like the Chris Fabry's send-up of last-minute Christmas shopping, Silent Night, Solstice Night, all is calm, all half price. The tradition of adapting Christmas carols to contemporary political events has a long pedigree here in Britain. Hark the Herald Angels Sing has proved particularly appealing to parodists. During the abdication crisis of 1937, of course, a version circulated which began, "Hark the herald angels sing, Mrs. Simpson's pinched our king." And a group of journalists, of which I was one, heralded the birth of the Social Democratic Party, some of you may remember, in 1981. We produced a book called The Travelling Hacks SDP Songbook, as we followed the party from its first conference in Perth down to Bradford, down to London. Hark the Times and Guardian roar, glory to the gang of four. In some ways, it seems a great shame that this tradition has apparently died out, and that the recent Brexit election, and indeed the whole Brexit referendum, didn't inspire any similarly wildly or widely circulated parodies. Surely can't be because carols have lost their familiarity and their ability to be instantly recognized, even in adapted form. Maybe things are just so grim nowadays that we just want to sing them in their original pure simplicity and childhood innocence, with the angels, the Christ child, and the promise of a more peaceful and joyful world, and we're not really in the mood to parody them. I want to just talk a little bit about the carols that we're going to be singing and hearing in the service that follows this. O Come All Ye Faithful, I've already mentioned. I don't think we're singing it in Latin, are we? So there are no coded messages. We're singing the OK English version, but you can think of the Jacobites if you want to, if any of you have sympathies in that direction. We then have Once in Royal David City, which is, of course, one of the great classic Victorian hymns, consistently in the top 10. written by the redoubtable Cecil Francis Alexander of There Is a Green Hill Far Away and many others, for one of her hymns for little children, published in 1848, written, as many of her hymns were, basically to teach children articles of the Christian faith, and particularly of the Creed. He came down from heaven and was incarnate by the Holy Ghost of the Virgin Mary, is what she's exegeting there. It does have, of course, a wonderful bit of Victorian moralizing, which I'm delighted to say you have excised from tonight's service. Christian children all must be mild, obedient, good as he. We won't be singing that, which I think won't disturb any of us that we aren't. In many respects, it's a very admirable hymn theologically, expressing Jesus' full humanity as well as his full divinity. And it has that wonderful line, tears and smiles like us he knew, in very marked contrast to the heretical, docetic line of Away in a Manger, the little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. So it's a much sounder hymn theologically, and I think wonderful to sing. We're then going to sing the first Noel, which is probably another 19th century carol. We can't find any texts for it earlier than 1817, although it may conceivably have earlier origins. It comes in a book of Cornish carols produced in 1817, really at the start of the whole 19th century movement to capture carols and write them down. And it was possibly sung, again, it would have been entirely extra-ecclesial around the streets and homes. Its tune has come in for rather a lot of stick. Eric Routley, whom I've already mentioned, describes it as rather terrible and points out that when it's sung in full, I don't think we're singing it in full, one two-line phrase is repeated 27 times, and in his words, it's repetitive to the point of hideous boredom. I don't think it was originally sung to the tune which I suspect we're going to sing it to tonight. It probably originally went to this tune. The first Noel, the angel did say, was to certain poor shepherds in fields as they lay, in fields where they lay keeping their sheep on a cold winter's night that was so deep. In other words, the tune we associate with On Christmas Night All Christians Sing, a stronger tune, I think, but I suspect it's too late now, as the Sergeant of Police famously said in The Pirates of Penzance. We should have thought of that before we joined the force. It's probably too late to change it. But for all its faults, the tune we'll be singing it to is firmly embedded in our collective consciousness and indeed unconsciousness. And of course, carols work their wonder and their magic because of that deep, intangible appeal that mixes nostalgia and childhood memories and yearning and longing and faith and half-faith and yearning for faith. There's all sorts of wonderful things that go into making carols so magical and mysterious. And we'll get it even if we're singing a slightly duff tune for the first Noel. A rather more vigorous and inspiring tune accompanies another of tonight's carols, People Look East, which is an Advent carol, of course, and really the only thing we should be singing at the moment. As we know, we shouldn't really be singing any Christmas carols until really midnight on Christmas Eve. And if we were proper Presbyterians, or indeed anything else, we wouldn't really be singing any Christmas carols, but of course we all do, and in a sense, why not? But strictly speaking, of course, we should be singing Advent hymns up till the 25th of December. People Look East, which is very much an Advent hymn, was written in 1928 for the Oxford Book of Carols by the poet Eleanor Fargen. It's got some rather exciting theology, some wonderfully green theology. I can plug God is Green here, because as you may recall, she, and as you'll discover when you sing it, she calls on different parts of creation, inanimate creation as much as animate creation, to herald and praise Jesus' birth. There's that wonderful opening line of the second verse, furrows be glad. Though earth is bare, one more seed is planted there. She calls on the furrows of the earth, to be glad. And the full version goes on to call on the birds, the stars, and the angels to announce Christ's birth. So it's a wonderfully cosmic hymn. It's a wonderful eco hymn, Advent hymn, accompanied by a rather beautiful early 17th century French tune. Also of French provenance is what, for me, is the most interesting carol in tonight's service. And if the congregation here is typical of the country as a whole, it will be the most popular and appreciated. O Holy Night has consistently been Britain's favourite carol in just about every poll that has been taken over the last 5 years. And believe you me, I monitor these things extremely closely. I monitor two things: Britain's most popular funeral song and hymn, which is extremely interesting, and I won't go into that now, but that's all to do with the theology of musical theatre. But Britain's most popular carol has consistently been O Holy Night, which of course is not really a carol at all, certainly not a congregational carol. It's going to be sung tonight by the choir, and congregations struggle with it. Whenever I use it in a service, I normally get a soloist or the choir to do it. It's really a 19th century romantic ballad. Indeed, I would say, perhaps slightly cheekily, that it's the forerunner of the great throbbing power ballads of musical theatre. You could imagine Lloyd Webber writing it, I think. The original version was written in French in 1847. The words by a wine seller and amateur poet who was mayor of a small town near Avignon. And he commissioned the tune from a friend who was the leading French comic opera composer of his day, the Arthur Sullivan of France. That gives me another chance to plug dear old Arthur, as well as that wonderful tune for It Came Upon the Midnight Clear, half of which Sullivan got from an old Cornish carol and the second half of his own. He wrote some other wonderful carol tunes, but anyway. O Holy Night, in its original French incarnation, didn't get much taken up by the churches, I think largely because the author became a rather prominent free thinker and the composer was Jewish, so it didn't go down very well with the Catholic Church in France. But it really took off in the United States, thanks to a translation by another Unitarian minister. They pop up everywhere in the history of carols, slightly curiously, one might say, a Unitarian minister turned journalist who gave us the English translation that we will hear tonight and that we normally sing. It's said to have been the very first piece of music ever broadcast on radio. That was in the States, and of course it's been covered by all sorts of people, Perry Como, Mahalia Jackson, Nat King Cole, Pavarotti. It is essentially, for me, a belting solo piece which needs a really strong soprano or belting tenor. Over here, I may say, the Welsh soprano Catherine Jenkins shattered a glass chandelier while she was singing it in a live concert, so be careful where you sit tonight. You don't want one of these lights coming down, crashing down on you, so just watch where you sit when we get to O Holy Night. It's a thrilling song, but it does mark, I think, a very significant turning away from traditional popular congregational carols to much more performed solo and choir numbers. And the fact that it has been number one in every British survey over the last 5 years, I think is highly suggestive, and sadly, I think, confirms that when it comes to carols, as possibly in many other respects, we have become a nation of passive listeners rather than enthusiastic participants. Like much of church music now, it is about performance rather than participation, and about an audience rather than a congregation. But that would be too gloomy a note to end on, so I'm sure we will sing the congregational carols in this service that follows with enthusiasm and with feeling, and with that wonderful combination of heartiness and wistfulness that carols somehow combine and draw from us. They do still undoubtedly touch a chord with not least the great non-church-going majority, as well as with the minority of believers. And let me end with a wonderfully positive testament to this, because almost exactly 5 years ago to the day, on the 1st of December 2016, my favourite supermarket, by a long way, Morrison's, and I do a completely unsolicited plug for them now, brought back the playing of Christmas carols on their sound systems, their supermarket sound systems, after a 15-year period when they'd been replaced by Christmas pop music. And Morrison's market research found that the great majority of their customers actually preferred carols to pop songs. Only 11% preferred pop songs, and the rest, most of the rest said carols were much better for getting people into the Christmas spirit. Now, one might cynically say, of course, that Morrison's also thought carols were better for getting the old Yuletime logs off the shelves and everything, and that we were more likely to buy if we hear In the Bleak Midwinter or Ding Dong Merrily on High than if we hear Santa's Got Stuck in the Chimney or whatever. But I think we can also take this rather, I find, inspiring vote of confidence in carols by Morrison's, sadly now taken over, but we won't go into that, but I just hope they're going to be all right. We can take it, I think, that the carol, those simple, popular, catchy, anarchic dance songs which celebrate the birth of Jesus in a folksy, and I don't mean folksy, I shouldn't say folksy because that's a rather pejorative word, but in the vulgar, in the best sense of the words, expressing the doctrine of the Incarnation, as we heard it so movingly being unpacked by Sally and Jan earlier this afternoon. And I mean, Jan referenced John Bell's songs. Of course, John Bell has written some wonderful incarnational carols, Funny Kind of Night, Funny Kind of Day, as has the Baptist minister Michael Foster with his wonderful encapsulation of Mary as the teenage mother. They're still being written. They still pack a considerable theological punch. They still resonate and appeal with many, many people who want to go on hearing and singing them, and for whom Christmas couldn't really be called Christmas without them. Thank you.
Ian has very kindly said that he would take questions. So are there any questions? Yes, please. Yeah, sorry. Oh, there's a mic coming. Hold on. The mic works. The mic works, yes. Oh. Yes, I can repeat the question back. Is this mic working? Is your mic working in? Yeah, fine. Okay, I'll repeat it. You want to come and say it here?
Is that working now?
Yeah, okay.
There we go, thank you. This is very dramatic for such a simple question. I was going to
Such a build-up.
Indeed. No, I purely wanted to ask you, firstly, what is your favourite carol, and what is it about that carol which hits the spot, both in a theological sense but also in a personal sense?
Wonderful. Yes, my favourite carol by a long way, and people will be appalled by this, is the Calypso carol by, see him lying on a bed of straw, a draughty stable and an open door. And I love it for three reasons. It takes the nativity away from all this snow and locates it, in the warm Caribbean, which is, I think, much more like where it happened in Palestine. I think it's got some wonderful lyrics, and that tune, I mean, you need the old maracas, And I just think it makes you dance. And for me, it's back to this idea of a wonderfully popular, slightly anarchic. I mean, it was written by a chap who was a Church of England minister of a very evangelical persuasion. And I was in touch with him. He died, sadly, very young of a brain tumour. But I think it's the most wonderful carol. It hits the spot with me. A lot of organists hate it, which suits me. No, they always have to play it when I'm taking a service, but you'd be better accompanying it with the old maracas and things. But no, for me it's joyful, it's simple, children love it. I was delighted to hear, I was taking a service in Glenrothes last Sunday and mentioned, because it was very cold again, I said, let's bop around to see him lying on a bed of straw. And several of the people said, we're teaching the children that this year. So that's my favourite. I think I'm in a minority of one. I don't know if anyone else likes the Calypso Carol. Very good? Oh, well, wonderful. I'm delighted. Anyway, that's my favourite. But thank you for asking the question. It was... People are appalled, really. It's a very vulgar carol.
I share this because it is a perfect segue from this lady's question. I've been a choir director my entire professional life, and I lost my organist the night at a Christmas concert when I directed my choir in that exact song.
Oh, really? In the Calypso Carol?
She tendered her resignation.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear. Did you manage to get her back by playing Bethlehem Down or something?
Yeah.
Very proper, very pope. Oh, dear. That's a wonderful story, yes.
Another question right over here. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Ian. Again, this is not a very serious question for what just the beautiful presentation you gave, but what would be your recommended carol for an African setting?
Carol, sorry, for African?
For an African church in Africa.
Gosh, I'm not well up on African carols. I'm just trying to think if we've got anything in CH4 of an African carol. I mean, we've, as you know, got a lot of African hymns and chants. I personally don't know of any African carols. You probably are better. Would you have one that you would suggest?
No, I'm wondering with all the carols. I mean, with all the carols that you've been in contact, which one would you recommend would be appropriate for an African setting? Because we sing, about snow and winter in Africa, and we don't know what that means.
You don't want the snow in the winter. It came upon the midnight clear, I find, a very powerful carol. Hush the noise, ye men of strife, and hear the angels sing. I mean, something, I think, with angels in it, angels from the realms of glory. I can't instantly think, and I don't know enough. I mean, I don't know enough about, I think, what... you sing a lot of traditional carols, don't you, in African churches? My experience of meeting Africans is often that they're still... what sort of carols would you be singing in your church? Sorry, we need the microphone.
So I'm a Presbyterian, and
Yes.
we still use the hymn from the Church of Scotland, so we're still singing the hymns.
Wonderful.
That is used here.
Yes. Well, I mean, we've got some very good carols, I think, in the Church Hymnary 4. I mean, some of John Bell's ones might be appropriate, which are very gritty and incarnational and contemporary. But, I mean, there must be African writers writing carols, aren't there? It would be better, would it not, if it came from within the tradition rather than something, I don't know, coming from outside? It's a very interesting question, but I'm not really sufficiently up on to know what would strike a chord. I mean, presumably, many of the traditional ones you would sing, but maybe something with angels, I don't know, I mean, the Calypso Carol, in some ways, mine is, riches for your poverty. I mean, it's got some very powerful lines, I think. Do you know the Calypso Carol? No, it's very good. It's in the hymnary, not the old church has got the one, but the new one.
Sorry, just
And
a
another
suggestion.
question,
Mary
yeah.
had a baby.
Yes, the Virgin Mary had a baby boy. The Virgin Mary had a baby
That one,
boy.
along the
The
Calypso line.
Virgin Mary had a baby boy. Do you know that one? That's a marvellous one, yes.
Thank you.
No,
That's
thanks.
wonderful. Yeah, that's great.
Very good.
Well, I think we should perhaps pull this occasion together and to an end. What can I say? At one point in your talk, Ian, you referred to a belting solo performance. And I think I'd like to pick up that phrase because you have been so lively, so witty, so informative, and you've really whetted our appetite for the carol service to come. I deeply regret that we haven't got the Calypso carol. We'll have to put that right. Now, alas, Ian's book on carols is out of print, but this afternoon I think could see the start of a campaign to persuade the publisher to reprint. However, his other recent publications, some of the many, are available on the bookstall in the Rainey Hall for the duration of the book festival. So, God is Green, as you see on the screen there, the biography of Arthur Sullivan, Columba, politician, penitent and pilgrim.
He's 1,500 years, next Tuesday is his birthday.
Yeah, so this is the anniversary edition, the
week.
special anniversary edition, and published just this year, The Quiet Haven, an anthology of readings on death and heaven. So I'll leave you to go and pick up those on the bookstall and have a look. But Ian, thank you so much for a rich, rich feast.